Dear Major General Chip Chapman, greetings. Glad to see you in First Western.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I would like to start with the historical visit of President Zelensky to the United Kingdom. What impressed you the most, and how could such a visit influence security assistance to our army?
Well, the first thing is that any leader, particularly a wartime leader, must have the capacity and will to rally men and women to a common purpose and the character which inspires confidence. And Zelensky does that. And I think it was important for three reasons, really. The first one is that one of the challenges, I think, this year is maintaining both the internal support in each individual country, alliance support, and making sure that people understand the nature of Russia. So the visit of President Zelensky to either the UK or the US to articulate why support should still be there is very important. The second reason, of course, is that in many ways the NATO countries, including the UK and Germany, are Ukraine's rear area. We will train 30,000 Ukrainians this year alongside of 9 other partner nations, and President Zelensky went to visit that training. So that is important because not only is training important and should never be compromised on, because the worst place to be on a battlefield is where is a battlefield where on-the-job training is not what you should do. So maintaining that training and having trained people rather than ill-equipped and ill-prepared people, as Russia seems to be doing, is really important. And the third reason is obviously that articulation of the need for continued equipment support, because as I think we said before, it's your total means of equipment, both and your strength of will, which gives you ultimately the power of resistance to overcome the enemy.
Speaking about important equipment, the United Kingdom announced long-range capabilities for Ukrainian Army. In your opinion, how could such long-range capabilities look like for us on the battlefield?
Well, it depends on the range of these, because the longer range that you give of precision strike munitions, which is really what we're talking about, this enables you to push the logistics of the enemy further back, which complicates the bringing momentum to bear on the battlefield. So it's both the range and the precision, which are the key things. Now, of course, there are 3 different areas of equipment which are still crucial for the Ukrainians. The first is making sure that those deliveries of the combined arms capability of artillery, air defense and tanks are still there in a timely fashion. The second one is this precision strike. And the third one is trying to make sure that you have a capable air force which can enable the ground force to move. So those are the 3 areas of capability that we really need in a timely fashion. And I think it is true that you do see all these things going through really 4 phases, which I think your Deputy Defence Minister said, which is firstly, it's phase 1 is no, we're not going to provide this. Secondly, let's talk about the technical feasibility. Thirdly, let's train the pilots for whatever capability it may be. And fourthly, let's deliver the capability. And that's the way it seems to go. But it needs to be done in a timely fashion to enable the Ukrainians to have a operational level victory in the shortest period of time possible.
Could we receive long-range cruise missiles, in your opinion, like Storm Shadow in the future? What do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think you can see Storm Shadow coming in the future. Now, of course, that's got a very long range, 550 kilometers. And again, as a military man, you would say that that is a capability that you need to fight the deep battle in the way that the Russians are fighting a deep battle against Ukraine in the use of cruise missiles to try and target the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. I don't see why Ukraine should have one hand tied behind its back. Now, I say that, of course, as a military man, that's how you would shape the battlefield as a military man. So can we? Yes, we can. Should we and must we are, of course, political questions, not military questions. And from a Ukrainian perspective in how you posit your capabilities, it is still, including in Bakhmut, that strategy bridge between political intent and military power, which is the key thing for the future.
You stated about training program for our pilots. In your opinion, could our pilots return to Ukraine from the United Kingdom after the completing of these programs on modern fighter jets even this year?
Well, it's like all these things. The capability is really all about integration. Ukrainian pilots wouldn't take them long to learn to fly another form of modern aircraft. It's fighting the aircraft, which is the key thing, and it's that integration of the avionics with the weapon systems, which would probably take more time. Would they be able to come back and fight this year? Probably would. I think one of the key things this year really is if MiG-29s are being given, some more MiG-29s, which I think they are, is that integration of Western weapon systems, such as the AIM-9 missile, for example, which is the key to enabling this to be fought, not just piloted.
I will look also to our situation on the ground. Heavy fightings continue in Bakhmut. What is your assessment of the situations are?
Well, I think you always have to look at what is the task and purpose of the fighting there. And the problem with Bakhmut, I think, from a Russian perspective, is really it's the same problem that Saddam Hussein sort of posited 32 years ago. And of course, the first Gulf War ended last week. In that this is seen as the mother of all battles. And a battle is a tactical level event. It is not by itself of any significance. It is how you structure those tactical events into operational effects for the strategic outcome that you wish to deliver, which is the key thing. So from a Ukrainian perspective, there's a number of things that you could posit on that in terms of this task and purpose of the mission. The first one is, at the moment, Ukraine seems to be in a holding posture. So that's the mission, that's the task. So what is the purpose of that? Is it to defeat the Russians? Is it to blunt the offensive power of the Russians? Is it to force the Russians to culminate so that they can't go any further, particularly into the operational effect they really want to do is to get towards Crimea and Sloviansk and take Donetsk province. If they can do all that, that would shape the conditions for a counterattack in the future for the Ukrainians. It is not a delay operation. It's not one of those operations when you're trading space for time. It is that mission verb of a holding operation at the moment. That is, it seems to be an operation where you're doing very well to enable you to accumulate your reserves so that when all the Western logistics and the Western combat power is finally there, that you can, at a time and place of your own choosing, go on the offensive. And of course, the weather also matters. There's no point doing an offensive operation at an operational level at the moment when you've got the mud of spring still abounding in Ukraine for at least a few more weeks.
So you think that it's important to stop and tackle Russians on Bakhmut and enable them to do further counteroffensives?
That would, I think, be the thinking. But as I said, that would obviously be part of the strategy bridge between the political leadership and the military leadership. If that is broken, then it would be a futile battle. At the end of the day, the key point is the losses on either side determine its significance and its importance.
But why Russia continues to try to capture Bakhmut despite heavy and unsustainable losses? Does it make any sense from a military point of view?
No, it doesn't make any sense from a military point of view. So if you were to take a geographical analogy from a UK perspective, two of the largest cities in northwest England, for example, would be Manchester and Liverpool, which I'm sure all your viewers have heard about because they have significant football teams. But to the south of that, in about the same distance away from Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, is a place called Kyiv, 70,000 population, the same as Bakhmut before the war. So it's, Liverpool and Manchester would be far more significant than Kyiv as an analogy. But of course, this has been vested with political significance because really the Russians haven't had any success since last June. So even a totemic victory there for them would be seen and politicized by Putin. So that is really the significance, I think, for the Russians. And what Ukraine must make sure they don't do is to become encircled and have a significant tactical defeat. But I think certainly at the moment, the way the war has gone, I think the generalship of the Ukrainians has been such that I don't see that happening. And if that were to happen, that would be a disaster from a Ukrainian perspective, because some of this at the moment is, of course, about narrative warfare. The facts don't actually matter. It's the meaning to the audience, and selling that to a Russian audience if Bakhmut were to fall with an encircled operation rather than a sort of withdrawal after the hold has enabled what Ukraine wishes to achieve from that. That's really the significance from their perspective. And of course, it's really this thing really which Churchill said after the Battle of El Alamein. Is it the beginning of the end, or is it the end of the beginning? And it depends which side you're on as to where the dice fall on the ground in answering that question.
Also, Russia used mercenaries to capture Bakhmut. Does it mean that they don't have enough qualified soldiers in their armed forces?
Not necessarily, but probably so in terms of their ability to mobilize. Now, just to explain that further, I think that the Russian army is far more prepared to fight to the last Wagnerian than it is to fight to the last military personnel, because in a sense they are in mere accounting terms, and Putin and the military seem to look at personnel just in mere accounting terms as off balance sheet. You know, they're not people that they put on their balance sheet, because although there are some, professionals within the Wagnerians, the ones that they've really just used as the human way were certainly those prisoners. So I think they are trying to fight the Wagnerians. The Russian army is trying to fight the Wagnerians, or fight the battle to the last Wagnerian, because of course a lot of this is also to do with power politics. Both Kadyrov and the leader of Wagnerians are political military barons in Russian political terms, and that would be potentially a threat to parts of Russian society and even Putin in the long term if he were to enable that to be a success, to be seen as a success for the Wagner Group by themselves.
Another situation we face in Vuhledar. The New York Times reported that Ukraine has won the biggest tank battle of the war, destroying more than 130 Russian tanks. What does it mean, and how could it impact the outcome of the war?
I think Vuhledar is really part of the Bakhmut battle. It was really to try a larger envelopment or encirclement of Bakhmut. So the significance is within that. The Russians hadn't been able to do a sort of pincer movement around Bakhmut. And as you say, Daniel, large losses of both mechanized armor and dismounted forces, significant numbers destroyed. And within that framework, it is the fact that I think they are running out of combat power. And that's why Bakhmut, therefore, comes back to Bakhmut and either the success or failure of Bakhmut. If Bakhmut from the Russian side is successful, that may enable them to say, we're on our way again, the momentum is with us, and may enable Putin to mobilize more soldiers. He hasn't certainly got the combat power with the first mobilization from last September to have any operational level effect this year. And that essentially was the message from the US Senate's annual worldwide threats report last week. And one of the prime intelligence community agency in America is the Defense National Intelligence. And it's always sage to read the comments of Avril Haines, who heads that up. They're primus inter pares of the 18 parts of the intelligence community in the US. And that's absolutely what they have said, that currently we still have this grinding attritional war, which neither side has a definitive advantage until Ukraine goes on the counteroffensive. And it does not look like Russia can institute a mandatory mobilization and doesn't have substantial reserves to go much further than they are at the moment.
Do you believe that Russia can conduct massive offenses and massive air campaign? Recently, US media reported that Russia prepared to do something big, but it hasn't come yet. In your opinion, can Russia try to capture Kyiv and conduct massive air campaign?
Well, I think this is being the two parts to that question, so let's separate them. The first thing, could they capture Kyiv again? Absolutely not. The second part, and I think I said on the interview early in February that one of the factors of success in 20th century land operations was actually control of the air. So one of the anomalous things at the moment is if you are trying to do another large offensive, control of the air should also be something that you try and have a mandatory effect within. And that is why, for example, to go back to the analogy I used about the mother of all battles, it was a 40-day air campaign, obviously by the Americans before they started land operations, which absolutely shaped the battlefield in Gulf War I. Now, the Russians aren't doing that. Now, of course, there can be a number of reasons for that, including the losses that they've sustained over the first year, the fact that maybe their engineering ability to keep the sortie rate and aircraft running is not good. And also the fact that the air defense density of the carpet on the floor means that they're taking unsustainable losses within the combat area, close air support, which is why partly the strikes on the energy infrastructure, of course, are offset strikes either from Belarus, the Black Sea, or from Russian airspace largely.
But it seems like Ukraine conduct massive air campaign on Russia. Dozens of explosions on occupied territories and on Russia have been reported. In your opinion, how could it influence the war and maybe could change situation on the Russia?
Well, again, this is part of the deep battle, and the increasing range of either Ukrainian drones or Ukrainian missiles or weaponeering, the ingenuity of the Ukrainians to solve a problem, means that fighting that deep battle creates more uncertainty. It helps to sever the logistics of the Russians, and also can come to the point where they might have to say, we can't sustain this anymore. And I think I mentioned before that the Clausewitzian Trinity, one of the parts of those goes, then you're in trouble. And that's either the army can't fight, no army fights to the last man, there's uncertainty in the political elites and they fracture, or the people of Russia say enough is enough. Now, it doesn't look like the people of Russia are saying enough is enough. There are small elements within the mobilized community who say enough is enough, but we haven't seen enough elite splits at the moment, although there are certain things you see within the sort of Prigozhin-Putin relationship, the Shoagi relationship, which show that there are tensions there. So all those are helpful to have this uncertainty in the Russian mind, because ultimately in war, it's not just physical effects, it's psychological effects at the operational and strategic level, which are more important.
And do you believe that such psychological effect could develop to change power in Russia and could make to Putin to stop the war?
Well, it could ultimately, and one of the difficulties within that, though, is trying to articulate a time frame that might occur. Now, I think if you look at the casualty rates, and this came from UK intelligence yesterday, that of course the elites and the main communities of Moscow and St. Petersburg have been shielded really from the casualty effects. But there are increasing centripetal effects, because of course a lot of people don't realize that the Russian Federation, it includes a large number of non-Russian parts to that. And if there is a imbalance in sacrifice, then that is something which can tear a country apart. So I think one of the scenarios one can posit is a civil war, for example, in the long term, if this goes badly wrong for Russia. So those tensions are there. They're not something which is going to tear it apart at the moment. But like all these things, authoritarian states always look stable right up to the point that they're not.
Could Ukrainian army liberate Crimea this year? In your opinion, what weapons we need to do this and what strategy we should imply?
Well, the bunch of capabilities in military terms that you need are those that we've already discussed. You need the combined arms capability within mechanized armor, air defense to enable you to move under an umbrella of close air support. And you need precision strike to shape the battlefield before you even think of going into Ukraine or near to Ukraine. Now, it is clear to me that Crimea is the ultimate prize. That is where the war will be won or lost, and where Putin's grip on power might well come apart. So it's a time and place of Ukraine's choosing based on how they look at the operational and strategic impact. The timing of that will be determined by when you have sufficient reserves and sufficient logistics based on the continued support and build-up of the Western supplied assets which are coming your way.
In your opinion, I would like to cover endgame scenarios. When and where the war could end, on Ukrainian territory or on Russian territory?
Well, certainly from the support of the Western community, I think they would like to see it end on Ukrainian territory. And of course, the easiest way for it to end is for Russian troops to go back across the border and leave Ukraine. The difficulty in geopolitical terms, of course, unless Putin and parts of his regime fall, is the illegal integration of the four provinces into what they see as the Russian Federation. Now, that is illegal. We know it's absurd. But the international community is hard over on the restoration of the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. How you do that should be up to you, and the Western powers should support that intent. Will it end in 2023? Again, you really can come up with multiple scenarios rather than timelines, and that is the right way to approach it. So why fighting stops is really for three reasons. Firstly is either by decisive military victory. We hope that's for Ukraine this year. The second one is because of the improbability of victory, which would lead to a negotiated outcome, hopefully on a just peace basis. It's not just peace that you want, which is why the Chinese peace plan was flawed. It didn't say that Russia was the aggressor. It didn't say anything about Ukrainian sovereignty being absolute. Or the third reason is because of unacceptable costs, either moral, politically, militarily, or industrially. And that has really been what the aim of the deep battle of the energy infrastructure campaign of the Russians has been, to dislocate and destroy the energy infrastructure of Ukraine so that it saps the will of the people to resist. Now, that's absolutely not been shown to be true in terms of, firstly, the ability of the Ukrainians to keep the power switched on. Secondly, your invincibility centers. And thirdly, because of a slightly strange campaign from the Russians, which in terms of its intensity and how often they do the attacks gives you Ukraine time to recover. So it's an odd campaign which won't succeed. And now that you're coming out of the winter, so you've got even less chance of succeeding. So both in the international field, where there was this politics of energy, switching off the gas last year to large parts of Europe, and the politics of energy in Ukraine, trying to force you into submission by turning the lights off, both of those have shown to be Pyrrhic in terms of the effects they've had from the Russians. If I was a Russian strategist, I would stop the energy infrastructure campaign because it's wasting their precious precision munitions for no effect. So it's an odd disconnect between how they're fighting the tactical battles in the Donbass and how they're trying to fight a deep battle with very, very little effect.
Speaking about negotiations, recently European media reported that European states, for example, Germany, France and Great Britain, pressure Ukraine to start negotiations with Russia. Don't you think that a bad peace is worse than a war?
I do. The object of war is a better peace. The key question within that is from whose perspective and whose rules and laws get to apply. And I would like to see the rules and laws of a democratic state applying, because I don't think that this would be the end if Ukraine were to have a negotiated peace which meant that it lost some of its independence and sovereignty. I think, and in the grand strategic term, given that Russia, certainly under this current regime, has a neo-imperialist outlook, they would just bide their time, build their forces and come again in 10, 15, 20, 30 years or whatever. And it's always worth remembering that the time between the First World War and the Second World War was only 21 years. And in grand strategic terms, we should think in decades and centuries, not in terms of 1 year, 2 year, 5 years. So a just peace and a better peace must be, from my perspective, one which is just and better from the Ukrainian perspective, not from the aggressors who've broken all the international laws, that is the Russian perspective.
And my last question will be about opinion of British society. How do you feel? Do British people support to help Ukraine as long as it takes?
Well, certainly that's been the mantra of President Biden and is still the mantra of the political class within the UK. I think that we still need to keep keeping this in the forefront of why this matters in both for Ukraine and for Europe, and that we don't suffer from Ukraine fatigue. It's not on the press as much as it was on sort of day one, second week, first month. There was a large uplift, of course, on the first anniversary, but there's less on the press about Ukraine. So we still must make sure that decision makers and the population here are actually informed about what's going on, why it matters, and that we don't suffer from Ukraine fatigue, and that the support remains the same and is strong for Ukraine. That is really, really important in the second year.
Do you feel that, for example, your friends, people who understand what is going on here and what is the situation on the ground?
It's probably, because the most support you get is from America, it's probably worth me just answering that from an American perspective, because I've just been in America for a few weeks talking to well-educated people, but people who get their views from certain parts of the media. And I was incredibly downhearted by their views on the war and really their ignorance on the war. And these are high-earning people who weren't really engaged that much in what was going on in Ukraine, and had taken some of their lines from the disinformation of certain news channels in America. So we've got to keep plugging away on this because winning both the information war is as important as winning on the ground with combat power.
Thank you, Major General Chip Chapman, for participation and for your time, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine, Daniel. Thank you for having me.